Welcome to this session of Family Communication. This is the third of 3 sessions talking about research into conflict as it occurs in a family setting. In the first 2 sessions, we talked about how spouses handle conflict and the possible negative effects of conflict on a spousal relationship. This third session narrowly focuses on a different kind of family conflict, conflict between parents and children. And before we get started talking about the specific research, we have to make several opening observations. First, the research on how parents and kids are in conflict with one another is quite different than that research that examines conflict between spouses. One way it differs is that there's frankly not as much of it. For whatever reason, researchers have been more interested in spousal conflict than they have conflict between parents and kids. Most of the research that's been done on conflict between parents and children has focused on teenagers and the kinds of conflict that they have with their parents during the adolescent years. Another observation to make is that there are more complexities and more idiosyncrasies in the conflict between parents and children's research than almost any other kind of research regarding kids and parents. That's because if you think about it, when you consider conflict as it occurs between parents and kids, you have the idiosyncrasies of one or two parents, you have the idiosyncrasies of each child, plus the idiosyncrasies of the family dynamic and the idiosyncrasies of the relationship between siblings, if there happen to be any. There are just so many individual factors at play that many researchers have found it difficult to draw the same kind of universal conclusions about conflict between parents and kids that we are able to draw between spouses. A final observation is simply that all of this research has focused really more on the negative effects of conflict than anything else. Or to put it differently, most of the research has looked at how conflict influences kids. So for example, research in conflict in single-parent homes, or research in how conflict leading up to divorce influences children. Much less of the research is focused on, if you will, functional families that don't have the same kinds of dysfunctional challenges that other families might have. And so because of this, and the idiosyncrasies mentioned above, much of what we say about conflict between parents and kids has to be taken with a grain of salt. Now, let's begin with this. Research has identified a handful of overarching dynamics that seem to be present in many of the conflict situations between parents and their children. One of those dynamics is what's called a modeling dynamic. What we mean by that is this. We know that parents have their own way of engaging in conflict with one another. So the research we've talked about in the previous 2 sessions has fairly well outlined what's going on when spouses are in conflict with each other. Well, one of the things we know is that parents oftentimes will interact in conflict with their kids in the same way they interact in conflict with each other. So, for example, if you have someone who has a kind of conflict style that includes a lot of yelling, includes a lot of coercion, includes a lot of gruffness, and perhaps some personal attacks, then chances are pretty good that when the parent and child are in conflict, the parent will do the same kinds of things in that situation as well. In addition, one of the oddities of the research is that kids tend to engage in conflict with their parents in the way that they've seen their parents engage in conflict with one another. And so what ends up happening is there's a replication effect, where whatever method of handling conflict the parents have between themselves is not only shown to the kids seem to pick that up and then reflect that back to the parent. This means that whatever potentially negative or dysfunctional aspects of conflict there are in the family are likely to be perpetuated. Or to put it differently, there seems to be a conflict loop that's very hard to get out of. And so it should come as no surprise that the same kinds of things that frustrate a spouse in the conflict that he or she has with the spouse is likely also to frustrate that person as they are involved in conflict with their kids. It also means that parents can't throw their hands up and say, I don't know where my child gets this, because according to the research, the child has seen this modeled by the parents. Another common dynamic that is part of many conflicts is what's known as an enforcement dynamic. Not just in the teenage years, but even in the younger years, we find that oftentimes parents and kids are very clearly aware of the views they have on a particular conflict matter. So for example, if a mother and her daughter are in conflict about the cleanliness of the daughter's room, the mom knows exactly where she stands and exactly where her daughter stands. Likewise, the daughter knows exactly where she stands and where her mom stands. The difficulty is what's called an enforcement dynamic. The challenge of the conflict is not so much understanding where you're coming from as much as it is a struggle over whose will is going to be enforced. Is it going to be the mom's forcing the daughter to clean up the room? Is it going to be the daughter that does a half-hearted job of cleaning the room and then is able to get the mom to sign off on that? This enforcement dynamic becomes very important because this often turns into a conflict over what's reasonable. So in this particular example, the mom has one view of what's a reasonably clean room. The daughter has a different view of what's a reasonably clean room. And research finds that oftentimes the real heart of the conflict is over whose definition of reasonable is going to carry the day. Research suggests this is especially true during the teenage years, when teenagers have their own views of what's reasonable that sometimes differs from that of adults. And that makes sense because we know that during adolescence, kids are trying to stretch their wings, so to speak. They're trying to establish their independence. They're trying to assert their own rights. And inevitably, when that happens, there will be different understandings of what's reasonable as that occurs. And so the enforcement dynamic becomes an important dynamic to understand because it gets to the heart of what many conflicts are really all about. Unfortunately, in the enforcement dynamic, it gives more power to the parent than the child. And I say unfortunately only because it means that when you have this power differential, you're almost inevitably going to be locked in to recurring patterns of conflict between parents and kids. Well, a third dynamic that some people have talked about is more narrowly focused on the teenage years. It's what's been called a misattribution dynamic. A misattribution dynamic works like this. As parents are in conflict with their teenage children, the parent tends to overly attribute negative thoughts to the teenagers, meaning the parent tends to see the child's behavior, tends to see the child's attitude as more negative than it really is. At the same time, research finds that teenagers also exhibit overly controlling thoughts toward the parent. Or to put it differently, they tend to see the parent as exhibiting more control than the parent really is. This, of course, means that oftentimes there's a miscommunication and a severe misunderstanding between parents and their teenage children when they find themselves in conflict. Because if the parent is typically thinking more negative kinds of things about the teenager, it makes it difficult to clearly see not only the topic at hand, but also the larger relationship. Similarly, if the teenager is misattributing control motives and actions to the parent, it poses a kind of block to the teenager acquiescing to what the parent desires in the conflict. So these three dynamics, while not present in every single conflict with parents and kids, are common enough that researchers believe that understanding them might lead to healthier conflict between parents and their kids. Another area of research in conflict between parents and kids deals with the differences along sex lines. So the sex research difference wants to ask the question, do mothers handle conflict with kids differently than fathers handle conflict with kids? Do mothers and sons have a different kind of conflict dynamic than mothers and daughters? All of this falls into the heading of what I called sex differences with respect to parents and kids in conflict. And much of this comes from researcher Gabriel Wyman. Wyman's research is very good because it's looked at some of those permutations and, perhaps not surprisingly, has found some rather significant differences between the way mothers and fathers handle conflict with their kids. So, for example, we know that comparatively, fathers have less conflict initiated with them than mothers do. Or to put it in different words, kids are more likely to engage in conflict with their mother than with their father. Now, research typically explains this with a number of explanations, one of which is that typically kids find fathers less yielding than they do mothers. Another explanation is because oftentimes fathers are perceived to be sterner and less able to change their minds than are mothers. Mothers are often perceived to be a bit more malleable. And so because of this, mothers are more likely to be the ones with whom they have a conflict with their children. A third explanation is because mothers tend to be the primary caregivers for children, even here in the 21st century, where gender roles have changed significantly. As the primary caregiver, it simply means that moms are more likely to be in situations where conflict arises. At the same time, it also means that mothers tend to sense a greater responsibility for the proper parenting of children, which will almost inevitably put them into conflict with kids on a more regular basis. Now, that's not to say that fathers don't feel a similar responsibility. It's just to say that comparatively speaking, moms have greater opportunity to act on that responsibility, and they tend to more intently feel that responsibility. Regardless, the difference is clear. Fathers tend to have less conflict initiated with them than do mothers. Another difference is with respect to fathers and daughters. We know, for example, that fathers start arguments with their daughters 3 times as often as they do with their sons. Or to put it differently, fathers far more often find themselves starting fights with their daughters than with their sons. And the chief explanation for this is that as daughters mature, fathers oftentimes find themselves on unstable footing with respect to how to parent them. In fact, much research finds that fathers swing back and forth as a kind of pendulum between being nice to their daughter and being stern with their daughter. And oftentimes, when fathers feel unsure of what they're supposed to do or how they're supposed to parent or how they should react in this situation, in particular with teenage daughters, they tend to react in the extreme. This, therefore, means they're more likely to initiate a conflict with them than they are with their sons. A second explanation for why this is true is that oftentimes fathers find themselves trying to bond with their sons, feeling that there should be a kind of connection between father and son. And because of this, that mitigates the likelihood that fathers are initiating conflict with their sons. On the other hand, sons initiate conflicts with their mothers 3 times as often as they do their fathers. Or to put it differently, sons really do seem to pick and poke at their moms more often than they do their fathers. Now, this I think is in line with the earlier research I mentioned about fathers just in general not being subject to as much initiated conflict. But one thing we have to say about this sons initiating conflict with mothers thing is that sons do this not just for some of the reasons we've talked about previously with respect to mothers and fathers, but also because some researchers believe that in the teenage years in particular, sons are beginning to shift into a more, if you will, adult male gender role, which includes establishing yourself in a hierarchy. And so there's more pushback against the mother as the female in the household. And so some researchers feel that sons in the teenage years initiate more conflict with mom because they're essentially trying to establish their spot in the hierarchy. Another difference along these lines is that mothers are more likely than fathers to end conflicts with their kids in a kind of standoff, right? Or some kind of a compromise that is very ill-suited. And by ill-suited, I mean really kind of unbiased in one way or another. And so the idea then is that mothers oftentimes find an unsatisfactory resolution to the standoff or to the conflict. So let me give you an example. Back to the mother and daughter trying to, in a conflict about the mother wanting the daughter to clean her room. If the daughter doesn't clean the room to the mom's satisfaction, the mom might get on the daughter again. The daughter might throw a little bit of a fit and there's a bit more of a conflict. And finally the mom says, okay, fine, just do this for me and we'll call it good. Now, that's a compromise, but it's kind of an unbalanced compromise because it's not really what the mom wanted to do. She wanted the room to be much cleaner. It wasn't. The mom gave in. And so the mom, reflecting back on that conflict, is dissatisfied with the way the conflict ended. Or it might well be that the mom says to the daughter, you will do this, you will do exactly as I say, and that's just the way it's going to be. The daughter says, well, can't you just give in a little bit? And the mom says, no, and then makes a very small compromise that the daughter feels is unreasonable. In that situation, it's also unbalanced, and so the research suggests that the daughter is dissatisfied with that particular compromise. And so the idea then is that mothers and daughters do seem, in particular, to have this kind of a thing going on in the example I gave you as an example of the larger notion of mothers ending conflicts more often than fathers with standoffs or compromises of some kind. So one of the largest areas of the research with respect to conflict and how parents and kids are involved in conflict has to do with the effect that spousal conflict has on the kids. By this I mean, what are the effects on children when mom and dad fight often or when they fight with great intensity? And most of the research here has talked about what's been called a spillover effect. A spillover effect is where whatever negative things are happening with the parents trickle down or spill over and have similarly negative effects on the children. Interestingly enough, research suggests that many parents feel as if there is this kind of compartmentalization that takes the conflict they are involved in and somehow keeps it contained to this area of family life. They think, therefore, that it doesn't bleed over into the relationship they have with their kids or to the kids' general emotional well-being within the family. Sadly, that kind of containment is typically not happening. In fact, far more common it is that whatever's going on with the spouses with respect to conflict is, in fact, spilling over and influencing the children. Cheryl Buehler is one of the researchers who studied this area with great significance, and her conclusions, I think, are worth noting. One of the things that we find is that whenever there is consistent conflict between parents, there tend to be several specific negative effects on the kids. So, for example, there tends to be more conflict between parents and kids. Or to put it differently, if mom and dad fight a lot, chances are pretty good mom and dad are going to fight with the kids on a regular basis as well. We also know that the more that parents are involved in conflict, the higher the anxiety level in their kids. Kids get anxious when they see and hear their parents fight. That's true at virtually every age group that we've studied. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about fourth graders, eighth graders, or seniors in high school. There's a discernible rise in level of anxiety that we see in kids when they observe their parents in conflict. Interestingly enough, that rise of anxiety is true for younger children, even if the parents are involving themselves in a relatively well-managed kind of a conflict. Obviously, the nastier the conflict, the more raised voices, the more threatening the conflict is from an interpersonal standpoint, then the more likely it is these kids are going to have some kind of a negative effect. Also, we find, at least from Buehler's research, that when parents fight a lot, their kids perceive the relationship with their parents as being a rather negative one. Or to put it differently, when kids see their parents fighting a lot, they tend to have this kind of tension between themselves and their parent. And the most common explanation for that, at least among younger kids, is that the kids are afraid that they will do something that will trigger conflict between themselves and their parent. I said a moment ago that one of the common negative effects is that if parents are involved in conflict with themselves, they're likely to be involved in conflict with their kids. Well, that creates a situation where there's some tension because the kids don't want to do something unintentionally to start that conflict with their parents, or in essence, to trigger the kind of spillover effect that we've talked about. If there's any clear-cut research finding from Buehler's research and other people's regarding the spillover effect, it is this. Kids that are experiencing significantly destructive conflict between their parents are worse off than in almost any other kind of situation. Or to put it differently, if there is a lot of conflict going on in a home, the kids are better off being removed from that than anything else. So, for example, generally speaking, all things being equal, if you've got a kid in a situation where the parents have divorced and a kid in a situation where the parents are together, but the together parents have a lot of conflict, the kids are better off in a situation where the parents are divorced. That's hard for some people to hear, but that's a pretty clear and consistent research finding in a number of individuals' research. So another area of research that has been investigated fairly thoroughly is what's called triangulation. Triangulation is a term that refers to this idea that kids become involved in whatever conflict their parents are having. The kids, in a sense, feel caught in the middle between their parents' conflict. So the metaphor is one of a triangle with three particular sides, the two parents and then the children. Triangulation is a particularly common kind of phenomenon that occurs, and it can occur whether there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 children in the family, because it's possible for one child to get drawn in, or it's possible for multiple children to get drawn in. Regardless, what happens is a situation of triangulation. And when kids feel as if they're in the middle or drawn into the conflict, they almost always feel as if they have to choose a side. Now, the choosing of a side can be as simple as being asked to agree, or asked to provide information, or being asked in some way to be supportive of a parent. But regardless, the child feels as if some choice has to be made. And so by definition, the child feels as if by choosing one parent, they are rejecting or not choosing the other parent. Now, triangulation, even of a relatively mild variety, has been found to have a number of relatively negative effects. So one effect is that kids often blame themselves for their parents' conflict. By getting drawn into the conflict, kids oftentimes mentally make a move that says that somehow they must be at fault for this conflict, minimally for prolonging it since they've been drawn into it, and perhaps maximally for starting the conflict itself. We also know from research that when kids are triangulated, they're more likely to feel that home is not a safe place. They're more likely to feel as if conflict can pop up at any time, and so this lowers the sense of security that kids have within the walls of their own home. And also we know that kids that are frequently triangulated tend to internalize their own problems. They tend not to talk about whatever problems are swimming around in their life because they're afraid that in doing so, that might put them in a situation where they have to choose between the disparate opinions or disparate reactions of the parents. And so if a child is having trouble with school, if he's being bullied, for example, the child might not share that with the parents for fear that sharing that information might lead to a conflict between the parents, which then in turn results in the kinds of negative things we've talked about a moment ago. Now, another idea that oftentimes is studied significantly is the notion of emotional security. Emotional security. So the idea is that one of the most important aspects of child rearing is to create an environment where kids will feel emotionally secure. That is to say, they feel as if they are safe. They feel as if there's warmth and supportiveness. They don't feel a sense of threat. Or if they do feel any of those things, it's fleeting and very episodic. So emotional security in much research has been found to be an important part of child rearing because it tends to set the stage for a lot of positive or negative outcomes later in life. We know, for example, that the more emotionally secure a child is as he or she grows up, the less likely they are to be involved in a number of antisocial behaviors. On the other hand, those kids that grow up with very little emotional security are far more likely to engage in antisocial behaviors. So emotional security becomes rather important. And so one of the things we know is that when parents have recurring negative or destructive conflict, that spillover effect we talked about later significantly lowers a child's perception of emotional security. And when that happens, oftentimes, kids become maladjusted. That is to say, they oftentimes will lash out. They'll oftentimes have trouble in school. They'll oftentimes have difficulty in the relationship with their friends, and sadly, this begins to manifest itself at a very young age. Now, if you think about the research findings I've just mentioned and connect it back to what I said a few moments ago about the compartmentalization, there's a real possibility for problems. Now, mom and dad feel that whatever conflict they have, they might be able to compartmentalize and keep from the children, or at least keep whatever negative effects there are from spilling over to the children. But the research we've just talked about regarding emotional security suggests that when that ostensibly compartmentalized conflict occurs, in fact, it does have a negative effect, specifically the effect of lowering the emotional security that a child feels. And so if that conflict between the spouses, between the parents, is significantly destructive and negative, it's going to have a negative effect on the kids. It simply is not compartmentalized. And so if you needed any more incentive from the end of the first two sessions about conflict between spouses, incentive to ensure that the conflict is not nasty and not recurring, this research gives you a powerful additional incentive, which is to say, to try and shield kids from the negative aspects of that kind of conflict. Well, a significantly researched area of conflict between parents and kids has to do with the communicative effects of divorce. And the reason why we talk about this here is because oftentimes divorce is accompanied by conflict. And in fact, usually divorce is preceded by some kind of significant pattern of conflict. And so in the research regarding divorce, one sub-area is this notion of the effects of divorce on children. And while that topic is far beyond the scope of this course, we can take a portion of the research under that broad umbrella and talk about it. And so the portion we'll choose to talk about is how conflict works with kids in situations where there has been parental divorce. Because clearly, in the situation of divorce, there may well be conflict between parents and kids, or between kids and siblings. And there are rather significant effects. So for example, we know that children that come from homes where there has been a divorce, they will tend to exhibit more frequent and intense conflict in their own marriages. There's this almost intergenerational transmission with respect to conflict among those kids that come from homes where there has been a divorce. Most explanations for that ride along the lines of the normalization effect, where conflict is normalized. If kids see conflict and then divorce, they begin to think that conflict is normal. They begin to, in a sense, expect it. And so these kids, for example, become adults and have that attitude toward conflict we described as conflict is inevitable. And so when that happens, it's not a surprise that there would be more conflict with their spouse after they've been married, because that's what they themselves saw modeled in the home, even though their parents were divorced. We also know that kids that come from homes where there's been a divorce, they tend to, comparatively speaking, have less ability to well manage interpersonal conflicts with their spouse. So that means that if a child comes from a home where there's been a divorce, when that child grows up and marries, he or she is less likely to have the tools available to better handle conflict than what they saw with their parents. Now, of course, a lot of things can intervene to prevent that from happening. You can retrain someone. There's the influence of the spouse. That's all true, but all things being equal, we begin to see this, again, intergenerational kind of effect with respect to conflict. We also know that females that come from homes where there's been a divorce are, comparatively speaking, more likely to communicate poorly in their own marriages, which means that there may be some communicative dynamics set in place that make it difficult for her to communicate effectively with her own spouse. We also know that children that come from homes where there's a lot of conflict, where they feel caught in the middle as a part of that conflict, oftentimes have a lot of conflict in their later relationships. Now, this research is interesting because it finds that the conflict now is occurring not just in the spousal relationship, but also in friendships and in dating relationships before people even get married. So we know, for example, that they're more likely to engage in the negative reciprocity patterns we talked about earlier. We find that to be true especially during the dating years and then on into the marital years. We also know from the research, for example, that kids that come from those kinds of situations tend to see conflict not only as inevitable, but also as a regular part of interactions in all contexts, like work relationships or friendships. So the bottom line is that it's very, very dicey to suggest that there are no effects of divorce long-term with respect to how conflict is handled by the kids that have experienced that divorce. Now, again, it's far beyond the scope of this course to talk about the research on divorce and the effects of divorce or the causes of divorce. Suffice it to say that with respect to conflict and kids, a large area of research does continue to find a lot of negative effects that come from children that experience a divorce of their parents. And principally, those negative effects come because of the role conflict plays prior to and during the time when the divorce occurs. Well, as I said to begin this session, there is relatively less known about conflict between parents and kids than there is between spouses. And so we'll conclude this session simply by noting that conflict is a very dangerous thing with respect to children. It's very easy for negative effects to slip in. And so in the future, should you choose to marry and should there be children involved, you need to be really careful with conflict and the role that it plays. Because most parents, quite candidly, tend to downplay the effects of conflict. When the research is very clear, the effects are real and the effects are often negative.